Hello, this is a PowerPoint on the deadweight loss for indirect taxes and subsidies. A deadweight loss is a cost to society created by market inefficiency, which occurs when supply and demand are out of equilibrium. It's mainly used in economics. Deadweight loss can be applied to any deficiency caused by an inefficient allocation of resources. It can also be considered a loss of consumer and producer surplus. First, we'll look at taxation. This is indirect taxation, so taxes on goods and services. On the next slide, you will draw the imposition of a tax. You'll look at how the consumer and producer surplus is reduced, and then what is that area? Note, we do not consider the tax revenue as being part of the deadweight loss. So when we look at how consumer and producer surplus is reduced, it's going to be reduced by some of the taxes, by the tax area as well, but we're not going to consider that deadweight loss because we're going to assume that the taxes are being used in a meaningful way in the economy. So in other words, that the taxes are not an inefficient allocation of resources. So let's draw the imposition of a tax and shade in the deadweight loss. So we're going to take the supply curve and shift it up by the amount of the tax. We'll draw an arrow up representing the amount of the tax, and we'll call this S with tax. Once you have the tax line drawn, you want to put down a circle or a blob to indicate that that's the new equilibrium. And then we need to create a rectangular box that's wedged between the two supply curves. So I'm going to bring it down till it meets the other supply curve and bring it over. And then I'll bring it over at the top. And then just to make it clear that all between the blue dotted lines is the tax revenue. So we know with the tax that consumers pay more. So I'm putting PC at the top. They're paying more than what the equilibrium was. We know that producers are receiving less than they did before the tax, so they're no longer receiving PE. The whole blue box is the tax revenue. And so again, if we look at how the consumer and producer surplus has been lost, it ends up being this area that I'm shading in over here. And before I call that deadweight loss, I'm just going to emphasize that we are now producing less than what society optimally wanted us to produce at, which was QE. And we will call that shaded area the deadweight loss. And here's one drawn for your reference. Subsidies. These are a little trickier. You're going to draw a subsidy on the diagram on the following slide. You're going to outline the consumer and producer surplus after the subsidy. And then the area that is left over, that's not part of either surplus, so not part of the consumer surplus, nor part of the producer surplus, and yet is still part of the subsidy and paid for by the government and the taxpayer, is going to be known as the deadweight loss. So let's go through that process. Let's outline the consumer and producer surplus after the subsidy and shade in the deadweight loss. So first we'll start by drawing the subsidy, which shifts the supply curve down. So that's the amount of the subsidy, is that vertical shift down. So it could be $10 per ton or whatever the unit is. Call the new supply curve S with subsidy. Again, we want to put a blob or a circle indicating the new equilibrium so we don't make a mistake. And we want to draw a rectangle that's wedged between the two supply curves. So I'll bring it up and over, and I'll bring this over. We know that with a subsidy, consumers get to pay less than they did with the equilibrium price, so PC is on the bottom. We know that producers receive more because they get money both from the consumers and then a check or electronic transfer of funds from the government for the subsidy. So they're paid in two amounts, but the total amount that they receive is the PP, price that producers receive. Okay, so now comes the tricky part. Let's look at the increase in the consumer surplus. So I'm just going to draw these lines up by a little bit. Okay, so here we go with the consumer surplus coming all the way down to the price of PC that they're paying. Bring that across, and that great big triangle is the consumer surplus. Now let's look up, I hope this will show up nicely in terms of a color, the supplier surplus. So we're going to go all the way up to the PP, the price that producers receive, bring that over, and we have an overlapping triangles. But you'll note that there's an area that is neither covered by the green triangle nor the red triangle, by neither of the surpluses. And that is going to be this triangle here, which we will refer to as the deadweight loss. And then once again, if we go to the next slide, here it is drawn for you. The consumer surplus being the red triangle, the producer surplus being the blue triangle, and we can see that the red and the blue triangle, they overlap, but the one area that's not covered is by either surplus is the yellow triangle known as the deadweight loss. Thank you.